I'm Amy Blossom from Jackson County Library Services, and I welcome you to Windows in Time. Windows in Time is a series of local history talks, a program that's been developed by the Jackson County Library Services and Southern Oregon Historical Society. It is also part of the Southern Oregon History Show, which airs on Thursday nights at 6 p.m. You can also see us live, though, at the Medford and Ashland Libraries the first and second Wednesday of each month at noon. So are you ready for some history? Let's go!
My name is Joe Peterson, and I used to teach at SOU in American history. And one of the things that really kind of fascinated me was the fact that not only was there a Camp White, but there were also POWs there, German POWs that were brought to Camp White as a result of the British successfully defeating Rommel in the desert. The other thing that I thought was kind of fascinating was the fact that there was actually an attempt at re-education of these Nazi POWs. And it was 5 miles away in Medford, Oregon, or just 5 miles from Medford, Oregon, that this was all taking place at Camp White. The only thing there now is the Dome, but there were many, many buildings. It was a huge facility. So one of the things I was told if I was going to do this talk is I needed to make clear that there was a major military establishment out there many years ago, that there was also, there were a number of 160,000 POWs at various times, and that there were, not all at Camp White, of course, and that there were also, there was a re-education program. So for many people in the valley, this is the idea of a re-education of Nazis is probably the newest part of this talk. In order to give you some idea about the size of Camp White, because I don't think that's really well known by everybody that's moved into the area, like myself, in the last 20 years, it was officially dedicated in 1942 in September. You remember Pearl Harbor is just a few months before that. It was the second largest city in the state of Oregon, second only to Portland, I mean in terms of the number of people who were at Camp White. It had a population of 40,000. That's 3 times what Medford's population was at that time. It cost $27.5 million to build, and it was 77 square miles. So it's an enormous facility. And they did it in 10 months. As some people have suggested, there must not have been environmental impact statements in those days or anything that would hold up such a development. Both the 91st and later the 96th Division trained there, and they're the ones that are probably best known. It was named actually for the Adjutant General of Oregon's National Guard. Now, the 91st Infantry is fairly famous, and there's as you can see in this particular photo, it was all lined up and very, very significant. They eventually were all sent basically to the war front in Italy. There were even symbols, or Camp White was a very big deal, and at the base, at a wonderful museum they have there, you will see a pillow cover like this one. And there were a number of things like this that are still at the museum that you can go to right there at the Dome. Now, it was the British who requested that the Americans take the German POWs. The United States agreed to take 175,000 POWs, and they were all been captured by, as a result of the Afrika Korps defeat, Rommel's defeat. And so it was a major influx. And the problem was, where do we put all these POWs? This is a picture of Rommel's troops arriving stateside, and you can see that they basically have the clothes on their back, and that's about it. The POWs were brought by ship and then to New York City, and when they got to New York City, they were absolutely shocked because they had been shown propaganda films of New York City completely in rubble. And they were shocked that it was not totally destroyed. From New York, they were put on trains and dispersed throughout the United States. Now, when they got here, they were given new clothing that had PW marked on it in most places, some bigger than others. But as one of the men in this particular slide says, we received new underwear, socks, shirts, and uniforms. A large POW was printed on all items. PW actually is what they printed. We were reminded that everything we got was new, and it was also, it fit. And from the shoes up all the way to getting the proper size shoes, but we also got napkins and soap and toothbrushes and even a handkerchief. So we were quite excited. Now this is at a time, as you all know, when the United States is on war rationing basis, and so this is, there was some frustration with what the POWs were being given. Now this is an attempt, this next slide is an attempt to show you a partial showing of the POW camps. They were in 44 out of 48 states. So it was pretty much across the country. It would have been very likely you could have been in a state that had a POW camp. This particular map is absolutely not complete because there were a number of temporary camps that were set up as well as the more formal ones that are shown here. There was, for example, a Camp Adair up in the Corvallis area that had POWs, but that did not show up on the official U.S. maps. But there was the same kind of operation there as here, just that Camp White had more POWs. There were also some branch camps, and there was one down at Tule Lake that was formed in a former CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps camp. And what's interesting about that is it was very near the Japanese Relocation Center, Tule Lake camp that was for Japanese Americans, or a number of them were Japanese Americans, who were held there. And one of the German prisoners indicated that it was a little ironic to him that they seemed to have more freedom picking and digging potatoes than the Japanese Americans did in the camp nearby. Now, they were separated. The POWs had to be separated because not every POW was a hardcore Nazi. Some of these fellows were just young farm boys who, in fact, had been drafted by the German government. So there was a need to separate them into these different groups. And they were separated into, because there were beatings going on. There were hardcore Nazis who were after anybody who cooperated with the American officials. And so they were divided into Nazis, anti-Nazis, communists, and political neutrals. So it was actually quite a process of separating them out. They also separated out officers. And officers were all sent to separate camps. Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, got word of all this and got very concerned because she thought, we can't have beatings in our camps going on, and Nazis beating people up. What message does that send when we're fighting them on the fronts? And so she said, I've got to talk to Franklin about this. And she did. And she convinced him that there needed to be some sort of a education program. But it's difficult because of the Geneva Accords. It could be seen as brainwashing. So they had to be careful how they phrased it. And actually they called it an intellectual diversion program because that was more in keeping with the 1929 Geneva Accords. And at Camp White, this program was established, and a man was trained, Lieutenant Fahey, and his job was to re-educate these former German, that varied in degree as to whether they were Nazi or not, or how strong they were committed to Nazism. But Camp White had somewhere around, well, the slide says 1,662 of 375,000. But we think that number's low. And the reason is because more research has been done out at Camp White since that slide was made. And the reality is that they have the list at Camp White Museum of all the Nazi or the German POWs that were ever committed there, and the number gets much closer to 2,000 than this number does. So why do you have a secret POW re-education program? My gosh, you're in the middle of the greatest war in history. What in the world are you doing with something as bizarre as this? It seems bizarre to many. And many would say, how do you train a former Nazi into being a democratic citizen? Well, there were three factors. One was the 1929 Geneva Convention requirements did allow for the possibility of some educational diversions, as they were called. Secondly, this political violence had to be stopped in the camps because it made America look bad, especially from the presidential level on down. And so they needed to break the grip of these Nazis who seemed to be controlling the camps. And then finally, the Americans were sure they were going to win, even in 1943, 1944. And so when there was a war was over and Germany was going to be, what was post-war Germany going to be? Certainly we're not going to revert to Hitler and Nazism. So the reality is, could we establish a democratic government? And could these retrained Germans play a major part in that possibility? So this is the way the slide I'm showing you now is the way the Camp White POW camp looked. The guard towers like you would expect. Actually a double row of barbed wire with dogs, fairly vicious, trained dogs, running between the barbed wire. The humorous part of this whole thing, though, is that if there's humor in this, and that is that the dogs were befriended by the POWs. They gave them food and so forth, and they no longer gave them a hard time. They just cut holes in the fences and treated them as pets. Some people have suggested they were probably German shepherds. Maybe that was a factor in how easily they were converted. Now, how do you comply with the Geneva Convention of 1929 and also give significant freedoms to these POWs? And why do you do this? Why do you worry so much about following these guidelines? Well, because Germany had also signed these guidelines back in 1929, and Germany held thousands of our POWs. And the possibility that they would harm our people in retaliation was serious. And so everything was meticulously followed in terms of the Geneva Accords. The slide I have up now is about what the Accords provided for. One is that the POWs were allowed to govern themselves, and they cannot be denationalized, which is translated as brainwashing. They can't be brainwashed. Now, how are you going to do this if they have to teach themselves or they run the programs? They were provided with new clothes, sports equipment, musical instruments, all those kinds of things, other diversions. Officers were not required to work and were given monthly allowances. Also, there were radios could be owned and were unrestricted as to the programs they could listen to. It's before television has any impact. And Articles 9 and 10 are the most crucial probably. Well, actually, I suppose there are three. POWs are to receive the same lodging, food, and health care in the same quantity and quality as the holding power. Now, we know that did not happen in Germany to our American troops, but we were hoping it would. If we treated them in a certain way, that we were hoping that our POWs would be treated likewise. And then finally, Article 17 is where we sneak in this idea of intellectual diversions, and that is that so long as possible, belligerents shall encourage intellectual diversions and sports organized by the prisoners. But again, if you notice, organized by the prisoners. So that means that they're going to have to be in charge of actually this re-education program, which could easily be sabotaged. There was a part of this program was a weekly journalism exercise, and the POWs put out their own individual newspapers, which they wrote and composed. Now, there was also a national newspaper that came out, but this was seen as propaganda by most of the POWs at Camp White. And the first issue, in fact, was bought up by one of the really hardcore Nazis and destroyed because he didn't want, in fact, any of this, what he considered American propaganda, to affect the attitude of the people, the POWs. But they were allowed to send letters home. And they were able to send once a week at taxpayer expense. They were able to send one letter and one postcard a week home. Why would you do this? Well, part of it is because they generally praised the conditions that they were serving under. And that's the message that the American government wanted to get back to the German government. So actually it was a bit self-serving, but nevertheless it was a humane thing to do. Now, the POWs themselves had come from a society where everything was propaganda, or it was a totalitarian regime, and so therefore it was hard to believe very much. Well, there are a couple of things they did believe, and one of them was Life magazine. If it was in Life magazine, which many of you remember, it was considered true. And that made a big difference in terms of what they would believe and what they wouldn't believe. There were 100 personal copies, subscriptions, to the Oregonian in camp. And there were another 80 copies of the Oregonian delivered daily, which is kind of interesting. You probably don't think of prisoners of war having their own subscription to the Oregonian. They got to elect their own leaders. And this particular fella, the slide that's up now, is the spokesperson for the German Africa Corps. He was a hardcore Nazi and later had to be shipped out, by the way. 134 of them, these fellows were that identified as hardcore Nazis, couldn't be reconstructed, were shipped out to Oklahoma, to one particular camp. Now, the interesting thing to me about Walter here, the German spokesperson, he didn't talk very much to the American officials, but one of the questions he had for the American officials in charge was, would he get his Volkswagen that he'd been making payments on when the war was over? That's how totally out of touch he was with what was happening with the war. Now I put up here a different O for the Oregon Ducks because this is more typical of that era. It was more the Walt Disney style. And at that time, there were 20 POWs at Camp White who were taking correspondence courses through the University of Oregon. And they had up to 30 plus offerings. So this is distance learning a long time ago. And in fact, one of the POWs who was in this program became a major newspaper editor and writer in Germany, in post-war Germany. I guess that's a classic example of success. Now, there were problems because it was extremely difficult for these young men to understand what it meant to be democratic. And they had been taught majority rule and all those kinds of things, and you take votes on things. You don't have a dictator who identifies everything for you. So they took democratic votes, and one of the questions that came up was, remember now, the Germans are still leading these classes, and one of the questions was, do we, in fact, go with a Lutheran service on Sunday or a Catholic service on Sunday? Why would that matter? Well, because Germany was roughly divided about half Catholic and half Lutheran before the war. And so for those who wanted to attend services, the question was, which one do we pick? And they took a vote, and the Lutherans won. And so all of a sudden, the American officials realized, wait a minute, what's the problem here? We can't just have Lutheran services on campus here, or on for just those who want to go to Lutheran services. And they called in the fellow who made the decision, the POW made the decision. He said, well, look, he said, I learned that in my classes, my democracy class. He said, I learned that majority rules. The Lutherans won fair and square. So as a result, they had to intercede, and they created a Catholic service as well as a Lutheran service. The Catholic service was in the evening, the Lutheran service was in the morning. It was difficult to get across these concepts. Camp White script, they were not paid in money. They were paid in script or, tickets. Work was optional. But if you did work, and of course it would be boring to have to sit around and not work, they would work in the orchards and they would work in the fields and the farms here. Southern Oregon was even more rural in those days. And they were paid 80 cents a day, which they could use at the, like cash at the canteen for cigarettes, magazines, things like that. You have to realize candy bars were 5 cents then, and all their room and board is provided. And so really 80 cents a day sounds ridiculous, but nevertheless it probably was reasonable in light of the fact they had no needs or had very few needs for anything else. There was a very generous treatment there. If you go through the museum, you will see the items that are in this next slide. And one is a file that has been sharpened down to a very sharp dagger-like knife. And the other tools that were used for woodworking were these small gouges that could be used. Well, these are bladed instruments, and you might think you would not want prisoners of war to have anything like that, but in fact, they had quite an operating wood shop, and these things were used there. Here's the next slide shows a table that was made by a couple of POWs. Many of these guys were craftsmen and had some real skill sets. These fellas would make tables and they would give them to the guards, or they would sell them once in a while to citizens that would come in. This time around you can see the POW or the PW more plainly on the clothing. They also were artists, and the fellow pictured here was a part of the art institute in Germany and was an instructor and was very sophisticated, and he did a number of paintings, and he taught painting classes, and he taught other POWs those. And so they would have people in from Medford, citizens, to come in and see their artwork. And hopefully, and some actually purchased their artwork. Some people got that through gifts and so forth. When I gave this presentation in Medford, a number of people came forward and said they had the artwork that some of these POWs had done. So that was an interesting aspect of all this. There are people in the valley who have artwork from this time period. But there was a woman who made the comment, oh, they'd probably as soon kill us as paint you, or as paint. So there were the negative comments as well. You've got to realize there was a fair amount of bitterness going on during this time too. Now, some of the Medford residents resented, like I was saying, how generously the POWs were treated, but others expressed surprise at how much they were like us. This guy could actually be a high school snapshot or a senior picture or something. You know, they were young men. The POWs were put to work in Southern Oregon and Tule Lake. The U.S. government made a profit on the POW labor because they charged the farmers for this labor, and they badly needed this labor. They really did, because their men were gone to war. And they were paid, it actually paid off. It was a net even break. The government was able to recoup from the farmers what it cost to educate the POWs and to house them. So it's an example of a government program that worked. There was a kind of interesting bonding between the prisoners and the farmers and even the guards. And for example, they would sometimes come home with pies, freshly made by the women at the various farms. Or they would come home with new clothes, and the farmer would go out and buy new clothes for them. And there were lots of examples like this. If you go to the museum again, you will find a 1946 Christmas card from a former German POW, which was sent to one of the guards or one of the workers there at Camp White. Here's an example of them picking apples. And local orchardists very much depended on the POW labor, and I've talked with many of those orchardists, and they said they could not have done it, frankly, without that help. Now, the night classes were taught in English, and several subjects were offered. A lot of government, a lot of American history, classes like that. But the trouble with it was that a number of these fellows were tired after they'd worked an 8 or 10 hour day out in the orchards. And so a night class was not really welcomed and probably not appreciated to the degree it could have been. This was more popular, and the slide I've just put up is a picture of Frank Zappa and his films. His films were made for the U.S. military to inspire American servicemen, but actually they played them at Camp White, and it's called Why We Fight films. There's a whole series of them. You can still get them. And it was interesting because they saw that as a turning point where they actually enjoyed those much more than they did the actual classes. Their favorite was Bing Crosby, Dear Bingo. He was a huge favorite among the POW moviegoers at Camp White, and they wanted to see Der Bingo regularly. Anytime that his films were on, they liked those. Oh, I went a little too far on that one. The next slide, though, shows some things that were shown to them, and this is atrocities. And these are the things that many of you have seen. These are the German camps for the Jews. These are the concentration camps, Dachau, and so forth. And when those were shown to the POWs at Camp White, they didn't believe it. They believed that no Germans could do that. And they were convinced that it must be Russians. So they attributed these pictures to Russians, not to them. VE Day, Victory in Europe, was May 8th, 1945, as you all know. And the biggest concern at Camp White was, are there going to be suicides? Are these Germans going to kill themselves as a result of this defeat? And there was really a lot of concern, and they added extra security and walked through all the barracks. But what they found was that, in fact, nobody believed it. They wouldn't believe that Germany had been defeated. And so there were no mass suicides. There was none of the things that they expected, nobody crying, nobody showing any belief that this could have happened. It wasn't until another battle, the Battle of the Bulge, which many of you know is towards the end of the war, when the new POWs came to camp from the Battle of the Bulge, captured there. And when that happened, there was a kind of acceptance at Camp White that maybe it was over and that they had lost. There's a wonderful story about the old POWs lined up welcoming the new POWs as they came into Camp White, and one fellow ran out of line, untypical of their discipline, and ran out and greeted one of the new POWs who'd been captured at the Battle of the Bulge, and it was his son. And so I don't know what the odds are with all those camps that they could end up in the same camp, the same holding place, but nevertheless they were, and that was pretty clear to everybody then at that point that the war for them was over. Now, did this work? Did it do any good, this re-education program? There's mixed reviews. There's a number of problems. One is that there were very few German speakers, and so amongst the Americans. So they didn't really know what was being said, and the ones who could speak some German were often Jewish American servicemen, and some of them had were not too cooperative towards these Germans who had in fact incarcerated and put their own families in concentration camps. The training for Lieutenant John Fahey, the man who was in charge of all this re-education, it consisted of 11 days. And he spoke no German, so he was totally dependent upon others. There wasn't a lot of interest in this by the High Command because the High Command was interested in winning the war, and the whole idea, they saw this as kind of superficial in a lot of ways. A lot of the men, as I mentioned, were too tired for night classes. They were providing a workforce, and that's what became most important. That's what the Americans most wanted, was this workforce. Remember, America is fairly rural and agricultural still in the 1940s. And so this became a very significant factor while their men were gone. Some of the bullying did continue by the Nazi hardcore, so they had to separate them out. So there was intimidation for people who cooperated. And most of the prisoners of war blamed the Nazi leaders. They really didn't believe that it was their fault. And secondly, they really weren't sure, were very skeptical that this democracy stuff would work in Germany. Now there's more. There's some success. The POW experience, they experienced humane treatment, as we saw in those letters they sent home. And that's a positive because they certainly, America followed the rules. They witnessed a peaceful transfer of power when FDR died during the war, and they got a sense of what the American process was all about. They heard Americans, even soldiers, openly criticizing their government, and there was no consequences. And so they got a sense of free speech, limited as it might have been. They read American newspapers, and they got divergent viewpoints from those newspapers, something they had not been experiencing. They were reintroduced to a lot of German authors and artists that had been banned under the National Socialism banner. And there was a spirit of America that was conveyed, and the secret program cost American taxpayers nothing, which is always attractive. But I think the most important thing may be that the U.S. obeyed international law, and common decency endured in what many would argue the worst of times. This young man became, Heinz Bertram is his name, became a poster boy for success at Camp White. He is one of those fellows who came back after he had been released and moved back to Germany and came back and took up citizenship and ran in the upholstery business in Medford for 25 years. So it's he's an interesting person and a sign of success. There were, frankly, not many of the POWs who in fact returned, but this particular fella is one that's well known in the Valley.
So thank you for coming and joining us this evening. And open your eyes. Remember, history is everywhere.